So in today's lesson, we're going to continue with grammar. We're going to learn how to count living things, unlike the non-living things that we talked about before. We're going to talk about family structures, and then part of the grammar is also going to be learning how to conjugate adjectives. So a pretty dense lesson, but hopefully you'll be able to keep up as we're going through this. The good news is that all of the foundation that you've had so far is going to help you remember a lot of these concepts. So we'll start with some grammar, and we'll talk about directional prepositions. That's a term I came up with. So basically it's just where things are to describe them. So a few new words to learn. So the first word is ue. Ue means above or on top of, up, whatever the context calls for. So ue. Opposite of ue is shita. So shita is below or under, depending on how you need to use it. Next word is naka. We already talked about naka, but I'm putting it back here in case you forgot. Also because it fits here. So naka is inside or in, within, depending on what you need to use. We have yoko. Yoko is besides, aside, next to, on the side of, whatever. Something that is next to something is yoko. We have mae. So mae is in front or before, whichever you need to use. So mae. And then the opposite of mae is ushiro. So ushiro is behind. Next we have left and right. So left is hidari and right is migi. And then last is in between. In between is aida. Aida has a special rule about how you actually use it. So we'll cover that when we get to it. So here's an example of how you would use these. Right, so this says tsukue no ue. So tsukue is a word that means desk or table. So tsukue is your desk, and so tsukue no ue is top of the desk. So on top of the desk is tsukue no ue. And then you could similarly replace ue with whichever of the other directional prepositions we studied on the previous slide. So you could have tsukue no shita, tsukue no mae, and that would tell you where it is. So here no is sort of working like the of that we talked about previously, where it is the right of, the left of, on top of, under, and so on. So here we have a full sentence. Don't worry if you don't recognize some of these words immediately, we'll talk about them. So, kiren wa tsukue no ushiro desu. So kiren is giraffe. So kiren wa, the giraffe is, tsukue no ushiro, so behind the desk. And then desu to say is. Right? So the giraffe is behind the desk. Kiren wa tsukue no ushiro desu. Here's the example with aida that I was talking about. So the way to use aida is to say what it is between, which if it's between two distinct objects, that's very similar to English. It's between the table and the chair, for example. That's something you would say. One thing that you can't do in Japanese with aida is to say that it's between this table. You can't say it's between the tables or between the desks. You would have to say it's between the table and the other table. So the way we have that is usagi wa, usagi is rabbit. So usagi wa tsukue to tsukue no aida desu. So tsukue to tsukue is the desk and the desk. And so it's two different desks, and aida in between. So usagi wa tsukue to tsukue no aida desu, and it's between the desks. So if the two words were different, then that's not so much of a problem. But it's when it's between two of the same object where either has to be used this way.
So if it was between two different objects, would the sentence just be the same, but one of the objects would be replaced with something different?
Yeah, so for example, if you said the wall, right? Wall is kabe. So, usagi wa tsukue to kabe no aida desu.
Oh.
And it's between the desk and the wall. So it is exactly the same as in English in that case. It's only when it's between two of the same object where, because you have the ease of being able to say plurals, you can say it's between the desks. Whereas because there's no concept of having a separate word or a word ending for plural things, you have to specify it's between a table and a table, so as to not give the impression that it is inside of a table somehow. I guess one thing I could mention, so instead of this, you could also use arimasu or imasu, and their verb endings as we talked about how to conjugate verbs, and you would use the location marker ni on top of that. So, instead of saying aida this, you could say aida ni imasu. Imasu because it's a rabbit, so it's alive. It's a minor thing, but just talking about using grammar that you've already learned and applying that knowledge here as well, so that it's not just the one way that I'm showing you how to use it, but also other ways that you can use what you already know. Tsukue no ue ni. So, tsukue no ue ni wa. So, ue was on top of. So, tsukue no ue ni wa, on top of the desk. Nani ga arimasu ka? What is there? And the response is computer ga arimasu. Which in English, what's on the desk? There is a computer. So it's not a word for word translation, it's a more natural translation. So rather than saying what is on top of the desk, I've just said what's on the desk. And then again, just a small reminder that this would be changed to an sound because Japanese have that contextually being able to change that pronunciation. So it wouldn't be computer, they would say computer actually. Okay, so we're going to go back to the koso ado pattern here, and we're going to talk about the kono sono ano dono. So we'd already talked about kore sore are dore, to talk about this, that, and then which. Kono, sono, ano, and dono specifically refer to this one, that one. So when you're singling out a specific object and you want to talk about specifically one object, rather than talking about one of a group of objects, you're saying this one specifically. So, and again, it's the same ko, so, a, do pattern. And so the words are kono, this one, sono, that one, ano, that one over there, and dono, which one. So there was a question, if you'll remember, from back when I first introduced the difference between dochi and dore, where I was asked, what would you use if you specifically wanted to talk about one object? And it's actually dono, rather than dochi or dore. When you have one of one object, you'd say dono. So, here's an example sentence. Kono hon wa omoshiroi desu ka? So, kono hon, this book. So you're probably holding a book and specifically asking this one here in my hands. Omoshiroi is interesting. So, omoshiroi desu ka? Is it interesting? And B responds, Ie, omoshiroku nai desu. No, it's not. And we talked about how to negate adjectives before. So I'll remind you that omoshiroi was an E adjective So you drop the E and add kunai. If it was a na adjective, then you would add janai at the end to negate it. So you see, we're using grammar that we've already studied to build interesting, complex sentences. And as long as you keep using it, you'll remember those rules. Alright, so let's go back to counters. I'm sorry that this lesson's a little haphazard, it's just I have a lot of topics. Alright, so we talked about how to count things with a couple of different, counters, and maybe you've forgotten them, that's fine. But we're going to introduce a couple of really important ones. So this one is probably one of the most important ones, which is counting people, because people are going to be one of the things that you have to give a count for most often when you're talking about things. So the word to count people for how many is nan-nin. So this kanji it's a couple of things. It's hito, nin, jin. It means person. In this case, it's nin. So nan-nin is how many people. And the words to count people. So hitori is one person. Futari is two people. And then after that, it's just number plus nin. So san-nin, yonin, gonin, rokunin, shichinin, hachinin, kyunin, junin, and then juichinin, junin, and so on. Also here, you're getting a sneak preview of the kanji for the numbers 1 to 10. You don't have to know them yet, but you get to see them. The main things are hitori and futari, because you will hear those words frequently when people talking about being alone, hitori desu, or when talking about the two of us, futari. So if you're watching Holo live stream specifically, if somebody says that they did something alone, then they will mention being hitori. Or if they're doing a collab and they say, oh, let's both do that together, that's like futari. Those are the two that you'll probably hear the most frequently.
Is futari a word that you can use to mean more than just two people when talking about people together?
That's an interesting question. I would say no. Generally, if you wanted to say let's all do something together, you'd say ishoni, which is as one group. So my instinct is that you would say futari when talking about two people together, specifically.
Okay.
Yeah, hitori bocchi means alone, specifically, or loneliness. So hitori bocchi is comes from hitori, so it makes a lot of sense. We have how to count animals. So this is how you count animals that are not birds, and then a couple of other exceptions that are also not counted, but it's most animals, including things like insects and so on. So almost everything would be this one. But again, remember, if you're not sure which one to use, there is the generic or abstract counter. Although, because these are living things, use this one if you're not sure, and then someone will correct you. So it's the biki counter or the hiki counter. So nan-biki is the question. This is the kanji that means hiki, but I've talked about before how you add dakten or handakten sometimes when you squash words together. So hiki will change to biki or piki depending on the usage. Similar to how we've seen he change to be before in certain times, such as when we're talking about the days of the week. So you have ippiki for one animal, nihiki, sanbiki, yonhiki, gohiki, roppiki, nanahiki, happiki, kyuhiki, juppiki, and then ju-ippiki, ju-nihiki, and so on. So once you go beyond 10, it's whatever that number plus, and you use the ending from the first 10 that we talked about. is there kanji for numbers above 10? Yes, there is. We talked about the man, sen. There's one even for hyaku. So you can write numbers that way. Also, if you wanted to write, let's say, 77, for example, you write it like that. So you can use kanji to write big numbers as well, but most people have adapted to using the Arabic numerals nowadays because your keys on the keyboard show up that way, and it's just consistent for everyone to use those.
Why not birds?
So the reason not birds is because of the upcoming counter that we're going to talk about. But it's a good question. So that's a good segue to birds. So for birds, you use nan-wa, or the wa, because you'll remember the wa particles written with ha. It also sometimes changes to nan-ba because it was the same at one point, but now they're separating it and using this hiragana wa just so that you don't think of it as being designated as a topic. So this kanji wa means wings, which is why you would count birds with it. You also count bats with it. Bizarrely, you also count rabbits with this one, but you also then don't count butterflies or something, for example, with this. Butterflies use the hiki counter, so it's weird. But here, wa means wings. And this is the same kanji in Uruha Rushia's name, so little interesting thing. So this one is relatively simple. It's ichi wa, ni wa, san wa, yon wa, go wa, roku wa, nana wa, hachi wa, kyu wa, ju wa, and so on. There are a couple of alternate names for some of these. They're less popular, but you might see them on newscasts or something like that because they're considered more correct, even if they're less common. So, san ba, yon ba, roppa, happa, and juppa, or jippa sometimes even. Those are more correct from like a I guess you get a similar debate that happens even in English, where some words are technically not correct to be used a certain way, but people will use it that way, such as 10 items or less is grammatically incorrect. It should be 10 items or fewer, but the signs will say 10 items or less when you go to a shopping mall. So for our purposes, if you just say the number plus wa, it's good enough. People will understand it. So let's use those counters in a sentence. So, Nihonjin no tomodachi wa nannin imasu ka? Nihonjin, so Nihon was Japan, Jin I said was people. So Nihonjin, Japanese people. Tomodachi was friends. Nannin imasu ka? How many do you have? So how many Japanese friends do you have? And over here we're seeing a noun, which is Nihonjin, being used as an adjective through the use of no. This kanji, kuro? Yeah, that's the kanji for iru. So this I can change to this. You probably haven't seen it because people have stopped using it as much. But I've left it in there just because you might see it if you're reading, say, like a novel or something, where they pay more attention to being technically correct. Whereas on the internet, in slang, in Hololive streams, for example, you'll probably just see it written in kana alone. One thing you might have noticed is this kanji and this kanji are the same, but here it's jin and here it's nin, And that's just something that happens with kanji, where the same thing can have multiple readings, and you'll just sort of remember them in context as you pick up vocabulary, how to read them correctly. I think I'd also mention that this can also be hito, but if it was, you'd probably see it on its own. So, ano kuruma ni inu ga 2匹です. So, ano kuruma, we just talked about the koso ado for kono sono. So, ano, that car over there, ni, so at that car over there, or in that car over there, inu ga, dogs, 2匹です, 2, right? So, there are 2 dogs in that car. And again, as I'd mentioned, you can move words around a little to use imas instead of des. So, you could say something like ano kuruma ni 2匹犬がいます or something like that. Either would be equally polite, equally correct, so it's just a preference thing. Generally, in fact, the tip that I will give you is if somebody asks you a question and it ends in des, respond with des. And if they ask you a question that ends with arimas or imas, respond with arimas or imas. Just stay consistent with what they've asked and you'll be fine. If you're the one setting the topic and so you get to choose which one you want to use, that's up to you. Maybe as you gain experience using both of them, you'll know which one feels more natural to you to use, whichever is and that's the one that you can default to. Now I'm going to just give you a few words that will be useful in grammatical contexts. You might recognize these from anime just because these tend to be words that get long pauses after them, or they occur so frequently that you might have just picked them up from reading subtitles. Soshite is one that I picked up from long pauses in anime first, before I started studying. And soshite is a conjunction that means and it's literally used to just connect 2 sentences. It's doing the exact same function as the English conjunctions do. So the way you'd use it is you'd have a sentence, you say soshite, and then you start your next sentence. And in fact, sometimes what might happen is you could have a long pause here before you start your next thought. So you might say something, pause for a while, and then say soshite and your next sentence. You could even have a pause here after saying soshite, which is what anime does, although it's a little weird in my opinion to naturally talk that way, because you wouldn't start your sentence, say and then stop for a while. So you go right into the thought generally. So you might not hear this outside anime with a long pause here, but you could hear a long pause after the first sentence as somebody takes a break to, I don't know, drink water or something.
It almost feels like a more fitting English word for that would be furthermore.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Or also.
Yeah. Again, it's contextually whatever fits. Use that for the most natural translation. So I have an example here. So we have Inu no namae wa Pochi desu. Soshite neko no namae wa Tama desu. So you can see how soshite here is joining 2 sentences. So you have Inu no namae, so the dog's name is Pochi, and Neko no namae, the cat's name is Tama. Pochi and Tama are typical names for cats and dogs. So that's why those are here. And soshite is just joining these 2 slightly disparate thoughts together. So if somebody asked you, oh, you have cool pets, what are their names? You'd say, Inu no namae wa Pochi desu. Soshite Neko no namae wa Tama desu. Right? And when you say it like that in sort of a normal flow, rather than reading it out as tilted as I am going through word by word, it starts to fit more naturally. In fact, if I was translating the sentence and not trying to demonstrate exactly how soshite is joining 2 sentences here, this would be one sentence, because in English it would just be the dog's name is Pochi and the cat's name is Tama. And that's the more natural translation, even though it's two separate sentences in Japanese. So now we have the location marker de. So this is to say, this is not like the location marker ni. This is specifically to say that you are doing something at a particular location. So ni was to say something is happening or something exists at a particular location. This one is specifically for when you do something at a particular location. So the usage would then be location, de, and the verb that you have. We have an example for this. So, tomodachi no ie de kola o nomimashita. Tomodachi no ie is friend's house. De kola is cola. Kola o nomimashita. So, nomu was to drink. Nomimashita would be drank in the past. So, I drank cola at a friend's house. So, again, this is different. For example, the marker, the destination marker ni, when we talked about when we were saying like ikimasu, for example, right? So tomodachi no ie ni ikimashita is I went to a friend's house. This is I drank at a friend's house. So subtle difference. So this might look a little small for you. What I'm trying to point out here is how choosing subtle particle choices changes the meaning of your sentence. So here's 13 different sentences, and they're in kanji just so I could fit them all on the screen, but I'll tell you what the words are and you should be fine. So the first word is watashi, so me. The second word is anata, which is you. The third word is restaurant, which is restaurant. And the last word is tabemashita, which is ate. So it's always going to be you, me, restaurant, ate. But the grammatical words that you fill in the middle change the meaning of the sentence. And so if you go sort of word by word on them, the first one is watashi wa anata no restaurant de tabemashita. So watashi wa is me, the subject, or the topic, sorry. Me, the topic. Anata no, your, restaurant de, at your restaurant, tabemashita, ate. So the first one is I ate at your restaurant. But if we picked a random sentence, like say, let's pick sentence number 9. Sentence number 9 is watashi wa anata to restaurant o tabemashita, which is me with you, the restaurant ate. So I ate the restaurant with you. Right, so little funny things that can happen if you use the wrong particles. So pay attention to it. If you pause on this screen when the recording is up and just go through each of these and see what sorts of funny sentences you can make just by reading all of these.
So just, I picked sentence 5, and does it say we ate our restaurant?
It is I also ate at your restaurant.
Oh.
So watashi mo is me included. So watashi mo anata no restaurant de tabemashita. So at your restaurant, I also ate. Which is a more normal sentence than say one at the bottom. If you look at sentence 12, it's watashi mo anata mo restaurant wa tabemashita, which is the restaurant ate you and me also. So yeah, the ones at the top are probably more normal, and then as you go further down the list, you descend into madness as you have people that are cannibalistic, or people eating buildings, or buildings eating people, and that sort of SCP Foundation stuff. This is just to have fun with particles, but also demonstrate why it's important to pay attention and make sure you use the right one. If you're not sure though, at least the good news is that someone will help you if you get it mixed up. They might say like, oh, did you mean this? Because generally from context, they can understand it. But these particles are doing a lot of work in carrying the context of a sentence because you don't have the same, words themselves don't carry context as much. It's the grammar that has all this context. So very important to make sure you use the right ones. Next is how to suggest something to someone. So, you have ways to say, I am doing this or not doing this. And you have ways to ask, are you doing this or not doing this? But now you have a way to ask, do you want to do this? And that's, you use the masen ka. So masen was won't, but masen ka is a question mark, won't. So it's similar to won't you or don't you, something like that. So your verb stem plus masen ka. So here's an example. It's a big sentence just because I'm cramming in previous things that we've talked about. You might not typically see sentences this complex, but the idea is to revise everything all at once. So, Raishu no getsuyobi ni watashi to eiga ni ikimasen ka? So let's break that down. Raishu no getsuyobi. Raishu, next week. Getsuyobi, Monday. So, Raishu no getsuyobi ni is on the Monday of next week, or in English just next Monday. Watashi to, with me. Eiga, eiga is movie. So eiga ni, to the movies. Ikimasen ka, won't you go? So won't you go to the movies with me next Monday? So this is like an invitation, right? So it's not a question like, will you go to the movies with me next Monday? It's more like, oh, do you want to go to the movies with me? So do you want to watch a movie next Monday? It's probably the most natural translation. But a more accurate translation to show you grammatically what's happening is, won't you go to the movies with me? So again, here it's literal versus feel. If I was translating this sentence in the wild, I would say, do you want to go to the movies with me? It's a suggestion. So now we have another word. This is mo, which we talked about a little bit. Kuro had asked a question when we talked about mo, which is inclusive. This is mo, which is slightly different. And it has a couple of different meanings depending on how you use it, which is why I have 3 different lines here. So it can mean already, it can mean more, and it could mean any more depending on the context. So the first usage is mo plus a past tense verb is already did this or already something. The second usage is mo plus a number would be more whatever the number is. So 3 more is like mo san, or if you had a counter word, for example, mo san biki, it would be 3 more. And then the last way you could use it is mo plus a negative verb or adjective would be won't do something anymore or not something anymore. Anymore here, it's the same mo, anymore becomes the English translation, so it's just taking on a different English word, but it means the same thing. So I have an example for each of these. Mo tabemashita ka? So we talked about tabemashita is ate, ka question. So mo tabemashita ka? Did you already eat? That's probably the number 1 thing that your mother would ask you if you were Japanese. So this is one way you could use mo tabemashita. You could also respond with mo tabemashita, I already ate. So somebody says, for example, ishoni tabemasen ka? You say, mo tabemashita. And then because we were already talking about using mo in this way, I thought I'll include this example. This is omae wa mou shindeiru. which is omae is you, mo is already, and shindeiru is shin is to die. So shindeiru, you're already dead. All right. So in this example, we're going to say I want more, for example. So mo ippiki hoshii desu. Hoshi was an adjective that means to want. So even though it's a verb in English, it's an adjective here. So mo ippiki hoshii desu. So I want one more. And interestingly, while the English sentence does not have this context, because of the Japanese sentence using specific counters for specific words, you know they're talking about wanting one more animal of a certain type. So they want one more animal. So it's probably a kid at a pet store saying, oh, I want one more. So mo ippiki hoshii desu. Then finally we have a sentence that I expect Nyani would say, which is mo kodomo janai desu. So kodomo means child, and kodomo janai is not a child. So mo kodomo janai desu is I'm not a child anymore. Next we have what in linguistics is called a volitional verb ending. Don't worry about what that means. It's masho. And it's basically let's do something together, or shall I do something type of thing. So if you have a verb plus masho, so this replaces your verb ending, right? Rather than mas, you're saying masho. So rather than ikimasu, which is I am going or we are going, ikimasho is let's go. And then you have masho ka is a suggestive question, which is shall I do this, probably for you. So shall I do this? Your verb stem plus the ending rather than mas or masen, masho or masho ka to have these two meanings. So hiru gohan o tabemashou. So hiru gohan is lunch. So hiru gohan o tabemashou. Let's eat lunch. Rather than say hiru gohan o tabemasu, which is I ate lunch or we ate lunch. Tabemashou is let's eat. Alright, and here's an example of using mashoka. So, anata no ie ni ikimashou ka? So, anata no ie is your house, ni destination marker. So, ikimashou ka, shall we go? So, anata no ie ni ikimashou ka? Shall we go to your house? So, this is again suggestive, but unlike where we talked about masenka, here mashoka is sort of should we do this together as opposed to will you do this with me? So slightly different ways to say similar things. So you might say, for example, eiga ni ikimashou ka is shall we go to the movies, as opposed to eiga ni ikimasen ka, which is oh, will you come to the movies with me? So masenka sort of says I'm already going, will you come with me? Whereas mashoka is I'm not planning to go yet, but should we go together? Slightly different connotations there, but hopefully a useful distinction between the two, being able to make subtle differences by using the right verb endings, allowing you to say exactly what you're trying to express. Next word is mada. So mada is not yet. Right? So the way to use that is mada plus a negative verb or a negative adjective. And so mada on its own means still, but using it with a negative verb or adjective would mean not yet this. Mada ikimasen. I'm not going yet. Simple example, but probably something that will come up somewhat frequently. Somebody might ask you, oh, are you going to the airport now? And you're like, oh, no, mada ikimasen. I'm not going yet. The response to Nyani's sentence, so if Nyani says that he's not a child anymore, kodomo janai, we can respond with mada otona janai desu. You're not an adult yet. It's a family structure. There are 2 slides here introducing a bunch of different relations that somebody can have to another person. The good news is you probably know at least half of these just from watching anime. So we'll go through them and we'll see if you do recognize them or not. So the very first one is Okasan. Okasan is mother. And you could use it differently. So I think I've talked about before how O and San are honorifics. So really it's just the ka part that indicates mother. As you can see from the kanji, this kanji means mother, and the rest of it around it in hiragana is honorifics. So you might hear people say things like ka-chan instead. But if you wanted to be respectful, or if you were talking about somebody else's mother, then okasan. So okasan, mother. Otosan, father. I think I mentioned Otosan before, definitely. These should be probably familiar from anime. By the way, there is a different way to say it as well. There's haha-ue and chichi-ue, but we'll talk about those at a different time. Haha being for mother and chichi being for father. And then ue, we talked about ue. So, okasan, otosan. Next, if you wanted to talk about son or daughter, you have musuko for son and musume for daughter. And you could add san after that. So if you were talking about your own child or your own children, you'd say musuko or musume. But if you're talking about somebody else's son or somebody else's daughter, it's a little more polite to then say, oh, musuko-san or musume-chan, something like that. So, sons and daughters, musuko, musume. Next, the two that are probably the most popular is Oni-san and One-san. Oni-san for older brother and One-san for older sister. I don't think I have to spend too long on those two. And then finally, on this slide, we have Ototo and Imoto. So Ototo for younger brother and Imoto for younger sister. So the first one is, and I've written it, it's the same word, but there's an honorific that comes before depending on who is talking. So it's Goshujin or just Shujin. So Shujin is when you're talking about my husband. So when you talk about your husband, you'd say Shujin. But if somebody else was talking about your husband, they'd say Goshujin, just to add a little bit of respect. So Shujin, Goshujin is your husband or husband. Next is Kanai. Kanai is my wife. Other people would not say Kanai to talk about your wife. And I'll talk about why that is later. Next up is you have Otto, which is my husband, and Tsuma, which is my wife. So Otto and Tsuma are words that you would use affectionately referring to your husband or your wife. Other people probably wouldn't use these words to talk about your husband or your wife. They would use, if they were talking about your husband, they'd use Goshujin. And if they were talking about your wife, they would use Okusan. They might use Tsuma depending on the region, but Okusan generally neutral, everyone's fine with. So you can also use Okusan if you're talking about your wife, or other people talking about your wife can also use Okusan. There's a reason why there are so many words for this. I'll get into those in a minute, but it's important to know that who is speaking affects which word you're allowed to use without seeming rude. You can technically use the word, it would just be considered rude or improper, I guess, depending on whether they're offended by it or they just think, oh, this person doesn't understand Japanese fully yet. Okay. Next, we have Oji-san. Oji-san is uncle, but it's also a random stranger that you call someone on the street as Mr. So this is something that I guess South Asians, Southeast Asians probably relate to a lot, which is just any random person on the street who's a male of a certain age is just uncle, right? That they don't have to be related to you in any way. You might not have ever seen them in your life before, but you would refer to them as uncle just because it's polite. Same thing in Japanese. So a random person on the street is Oji-san, as long as they're a certain age. So you wouldn't use Oji-san when talking to like a teenager, for example, or a really old man. Oji-san is for generally like a person probably around my age. So Oji-san, have them in kanji, but they're very uncommon for you to see them this way. And then specifically the first one is for your uncle who is older, and this is for an uncle who is younger than probably your mother or father. But you are basically never going to see these written in kanji except in literary contexts. Yapag, wata oji is exactly that, right? So it's watame plus oji-san. So oji-san as uncle is also a random stranger, right? And so just a random stranger being considered as like a pervert, right? So it's like normal people are one thing, and then you have creepy uncle. So wata oji, creepy uncle watame. Next is Obasan. So Obasan is the same thing as Oji-san for women, is aunt. So Obasan, very very important though with Oji-san and Obasan not to accidentally stretch out the vowel, because if you do, you get Oji-san and Obasan. Oji-san is grandfather and Obasan is grandmother, and also old man and old women, same way that you would. So if you saw a really old person on the street, someone who's like 70 or 80, you would say Oji-san because they're significantly older than you, out of reverence. But if you said it to someone who is maybe 40, that's insulting because they're not that old, but you're calling them old. So pay attention to the vowels, don't accidentally stretch it out. So Oji-san versus Oji-san, and Obasan versus Obasan. And again, as before, you can basically ignore the kanji because people don't use them. And then finally, you have okusan to just say children, and kodomo also to mean children. So okosan is when you're talking about someone else's children, someone else's child or children, you'd say okosan. This would be generic, so you're not specifically saying musuko or musume. You want to just generally say okosan. So if you were talking about children running around on the street, for example, or going to school, and then you have kodomo. Kodomo is typically my child or children that you would use it for. That said, we have, for example, kodomo no hi, which is Children's Day. So both words work in a number of contexts. So we'll talk about the nuance of why maybe you want to avoid using certain words when you're talking about somebody else's wife or somebody else's husband, right? So this is shujin, right? So it's made up of two parts, shu, jin, right? So the shu part sort of means like lord or chief or master, and the jin is person. So probably the best translation to English in terms of what the kanji is representing is sort of master, and then implicit in that is of the house. So it's not explicitly said that it is master of the house specifically, but shujin on its own is master, right? And there are some connotations that come with that when you call someone a master. It sort of implies something about familial relationships and about gender inequalities and so on. And particularly worse is kanai. Kanai is made up of this part, which means house. In fact, you've probably seen this kanji when we've been talking about ie so much. It's exactly the same kanji. And that one means house, and then this one means to be inside something, particularly inside a house or something. So kanai is inside the house, which is a very regressive way to be talking about your wife. It's based on old-fashioned words, but it's not how people probably feel anymore about these things. So referring to somebody else's wife as kanai is probably extremely rude, especially to the woman in question, because you're essentially relegating them to the kitchen or housework or something like that, one of those very regressive ideals. So it's maybe something that you might hear someone from the older generation referring to their wife specifically as kanai, but it's not something that I think modern women are going to be particularly happy if you use, and especially not something that you want to be saying about somebody else's wife. You don't want to refer to them as kanai. Shujin is actually the more proper way to refer to somebody's husband, is by saying goshujin. Despite having this, again, slightly regressive connotation, you don't want to use otto because that's a term of affection. So then, going back to this slide, we had tsuma. Tsuma is a more polite way to say, I mean, I wouldn't say more polite, probably. It's a less regressive way to refer to your wife while still being affectionate rather than calling them kanai, which is a word that you can use for your wife. You can use tsuma, and tsuma is, my wife, without having the regressive connotations that kanai does. So that's why I had those on there a couple of times. It's because I think the modern generation is not very receptive to that particular word. But you might hear it in literary contexts or from older people who are talking, or even older characters in an anime or something. You might hear this. So I included it just because. Yeah, Majima might use shujin to refer to his customers because shujin means master, right? And that's why when you're referring to somebody else's husband, you specifically say goshujin to distinguish that you're talking about your husband and not just any random master.
So would it be a sort of way to say sir?
It could be, but san is generally like the safer way to just say it, right? So somebody's name, san, is the most normal way to refer to them. And then if you really wanted to be respectful to them, you could change san to sama, and then that's assigning them a higher status, so showing deference. We I guess we haven't talked about those honorifics yet. We can talk about those later. I think there is a channel, Japanese with Yuta, where he goes over Japanese in anime and different contexts, and he had an episode specifically on Re-Zero and honorifics that people use in Re-Zero and the different levels of politeness that those convey, using sama, tan, dono, and things like that, which are less common, but they use those a lot in Re-Zero because the relationships between people politically does matter a lot. Also, I will mention, kanai being inside the house is actually just something you can say to mean inside the house. So it doesn't only mean wife derogatorily, it can also just mean inside the house. Yeah, people might use tsuma instead of kanai nowadays. They might also just use okusan. And then probably more frequently, so that's when referring to their wives to other people. When talking to their wife, they're not likely to use any of these. They're probably more likely to use anata. In this case, it would mean darling rather than just you. So now we're going to talk about Yoku and Amari or Anmari. So I guess these are also words. I'd said Mada is the last, but turns out we had a few more. So there are kanji versions. Ignore them. People stopped using these. So Yoku means often, and Amari or Anmari is the opposite, not often. So Amari versus Anmari is it's a choice for most people as to which one to use. Anmari seems to be more popular, even though Amari is probably more correct. Like kanji wise, if you see this, it is just Amari, but people have taken to saying Ammari just because it flows better. And then maybe contextually based on how they're using it, they might choose one over the other. But it's an opinion thing, you'll hear both somewhat equally. So Yoku and Anmari or Amari. There's a sentence that uses both at the same time. Nihon ni yoku kimasu. Demo, Chugoku ni wa anmari ikimasen. Nihon ni is to Japan. Yoku kimasu is I go often. Right? Actually, it's kimasu, so it's I come to Japan often. Right? So, small mistranslation there for me. But it's I come to Japan often. Demo, Chugoku ni wa, but to China, anmari ikimasen. I don't go often. So here it's sort of splitting the word in English into don't and often. That's just because of English grammatical rules, but it's one word. Yeah, so a couple of other ways you could use yoku though, which is why you might want to avoid saying yoku imasen, is you have this one, which is yoku dekimashita, which means well done, or you have yoku kimashita, which is I'm glad you came. So yoku does mean often, but it can also mean good or well, right? And so yoku dekimashita is a common saying that, you know, you'd hear like kindergarten teacher might say to the class, oh, yoku dekimashita, when everyone recites the alphabet correctly. And yoku kimashita is something you'd say to a friend who visited or something like that when they get home. You're like, ah, yoku kimashita, I'm happy you're here. So because yoku can mean a few other things, for the specific use that you're talking about, Kuro, you might probably use anmari instead, just to avoid confusion. And then to add some relevance to Hololive clips, from Coco's graduation, the last thing that Kanata said to her is yoku ganbatta, which is you did your best all the time. I have a couple of adjectives here, and this is where what is for you. I can stress some of these things if you need me to. So I have two examples. The first two are na adjectives, and the second two are e adjectives. So we have benri. Benri is convenient. And we have shinsetsu. Shinsetsu means kind. So both of those are na adjectives. Benri ends in an e sound, but it's a na adjective. And then for the e adjectives, we have omoshiroi, which is interesting, as we talked about, and we have furui, which is old, which we also talked about in an old lesson when we first talked about adjectives. So two examples of na adjectives, two examples of e adjectives. Most of my examples only use the first for each. But you know, you can imagine using the other ones as well. So to conjugate an e adjective to past tense, you drop the e and add katta at the end. So you had omoshiroi. Omoshiroi, drop the e, just becomes omoshiro. Add katta, omoshiro katta, and this is the positive past tense form. So changing interesting to was interesting is omoshiroi becomes omoshiro katta. Drop the e and add katta to indicate past tense. This is very important to understand because this is going to be the foundation for the other ways to conjugate e adjectives to past tense when you're talking about negative and so on. Yeah, we'll go over this one more time because it's so important. So omoshiroi, drop the e, you have omoshiro, add katta, omoshiro katta. And then your other example was furui, so furukatta. To do a na adjective, you can't actually change the adjective itself. You can't drop an e, for example. So what you have to do instead is you conjugate the verb. So benri, right, on its own, it stays as it is. It's a nominal adjective. That's what na adjectives are. It's a nominal, so the word doesn't change. So you have to conjugate the verb. And so benri des become benri deshta. So that's the verb ending that you're used to make it past tense. And then the other word we had was shinsetsu. So shinsetsu des and then shinsetsu deshita. So when something is convenient, it's benri des. And then when it was convenient, it is benri deshita, which written out here. So that's if you want positive past tense, right? But now we're going to talk about negative because we also want to be able to use the negative past tense. So first, let's go over negating the adjective. This will be what I want you to pay attention to, Waters, because you missed this. So for a na adjective, you just add janai at the end. So benri becomes benri janai. And for a e adjective, you drop the e and add kunai. So omoshiroi becomes omoshiro kunai because you drop the e, omoshiro kunai. Right. So we talked about this already when we covered adjectives initially, but this is important to revise because this is going to affect what comes up next. So the important thing to notice here is that these end in e. Both of these end in e. So benri janai and omoshiro kunai are adjectives on their own that mean not convenient and not interesting. They're e adjectives. Both of them are e adjectives. So when you want to make them past tense, what's going to happen is you drop the e after kunai and add katta at the end. So omoshiro kunai becomes omoshiro kunakatta. Right? So you can imagine this is what you're starting with. This is your e adjective. Drop the e, add katta. So omoshiro kunakatta, which is was not interesting. Okay, so now you have all four of the tenses that we talked about. Present positive, omoshiroi. Past positive, omoshiro katta. Present negative, omoshiro kunai. And negative past is omoshiro kunakatta. For a na adjective, this is where it gets confusing, right? So we talked about benri des and benri deshita, but when you add janai, that makes it an e adjective. And so it's benri janai and benri janakatta because you drop the e and add katta. By adding janai, you convert it to an e adjective. And then because it's an e adjective, you follow the same rule, which is drop e, add katta. So benri janakatta. So omoshiro kunakatta, benri janakatta. And then if you used the other example we had was shinsetsu, right? So shinsetsu janakatta. If it helps you, you might just want to remember that a janakatta is the verb ending, but it helped me to think of it as you've made it an e adjective and then you just add katta. Drop the e, add katta. So that way it's consistent. So here's a couple of examples. So Goshujin wa shinsetsu deshita. Your husband was kind. So goshujin specifically is your husband, not my husband, it would be your husband. So your husband, and shinsetsu katta is was kind. So your husband was kind. Or sorry, shinsetsu deshita. Sorry, not katta, deshita. So shinsetsu deshita. And here we have a tragedy of the commons. Watashi no kanojo. Watashi is me, kanojo was her, but could also be girlfriend. In this case, it is girlfriend. So, watashi no kanojo wa kirei janakatta desu. So, kirei is pretty. Kirei janai is not pretty. Kirei janakatta is was not pretty. So, watashi no kanojo wa kirei janakatta desu, which is my girlfriend was not pretty. And yeah, I'll point this out. So we're still using des at the end, right? Because kirei janakatta is just the adjective. So you still need to say des at the end. The same way that you had des here at the end of deshita. Deshita contains the des in it. So deshita, you had the des here. In this one, janakatta desu, you still have it. Kino no eiga wa suki janakatta desu. So, suki was like, it's an adjective. So, suki janakatta, I did not like. Kino no eiga. Kino was yesterday, eiga is movie. So, yesterday's movie. I didn't like yesterday's movie. So next lesson we'll talk finally about speaking casual Japanese. So up until now we've been talking what's called polite form. So it's not formal Japanese necessarily, it's just polite form. It's what you would use with strangers most commonly. So it's the safest way to talk with people that you're new to as you're meeting new people, especially if you're using like a chatting app or something to practice your Japanese. That's what you want to start with if you're talking to a native speaker, because you're still getting used to them. But once you actually do know them, you want to transition to using casual Japanese. Casual Japanese is also the one that you're going to encounter on HoloLive streams all the time, because they're talking to you as if they're your friends. So this is what you're going to hear more frequently. It's also the one that kids learn growing up, because they speak casually and only later do they learn to edit themselves to be more formal as the situation demands. And a lot of your anime is also going to use casual Japanese, because it's just how people talk, is they speak casually. So definitely come to the next lesson. It's going to reteach a lot of the things that you've learned, but with different sounds. So I kind of previewed that if you came to the review lesson where in Zomrap I showed you how da is replacing des for the casual form. That's the kind of thing where you relearn the same grammatical structure but with different sounds. Your conjugations will be different, but they work the same way. The rules are the same, the sounds are all that's changing, but it changes the politeness level. So it should be somewhat familiar, but also new. And one of the more useful lessons that you'll get in terms of being able to then watch a stream or listen to a podcast or anything like that if you're going to do that. So definitely tune in for that one. Thanks for coming, everyone.